Okay, so I wanted to continue today with the story of the Buddha's life. But first, I realized it's August 11th, which is the 8th anniversary of when we found this property. So I thought I should maybe tell you a little bit about the history of the Abbey, considering it's an anniversary day. So once upon a time, actually, I guess you could say the Abbey began during the Buddha's lifetime when the Buddha established the Sangha. And here the Sangha does not mean anybody who is a Buddhist or who attends a Buddhist temple or, or Dharma center, but it means the people who have taken monastic vows. Those are the Sangha in this conventional sense. So the Buddha started a monastic community for a purpose, because as we know, it's hard to practice in the midst of a society that has values that go in the opposite direction from the Dharma. Yeah? And sometimes Dharma practice is said to be like swimming upstream, or monastics are said to be like white crows. Yeah, how often do you see a white crow? You don't. Yeah. So, having the aspiration from liberation, for liberation from samsara is something rare. And to really live that aspiration, you need a lot of support. It's quite difficult to go out and practice on our own, especially, when we're with the rest of the world that's telling us we're nuts, or other variations of that. So the Sangha was set up so that people had a support system, and by supporting each other would practice better, but also so that there was a focal point for the practice. So for lay people who are living in the world and trying to practice, if they saw a Sangha community that gives them faith and inspiration, and they also know they can go there to receive teachings, they can go there to take precepts, to practice, and so on. So, there's many reasons that the Buddha established the Sangha, and part of it has to do with an individual's practice, so an individual can advance on the path, and part of it has to do with the effect on society and on others, and improving the state of society. Because in some way, a monastic community acts as a conscience to the planet. Yeah, when we're trying to live a life of simplicity, and the world is involved in consumption, then we are like a conscience. Of course, if the Sangha starts living lives of luxury, then there's some degeneration involved. In a world where it's said to have your own private money and your own stash, and build everything for yourself, and have your own golf course for your own family, as many of the wealthy in this country do. The Sangha stands in as something the opposite of that, saying, actually, you can be happy without having all of that. Okay? When we live in a world where the people on Wall Street are encouraged to do illegal and immoral actions that affect the rest of the country, and even doctors are getting involved in selling the medicines that they prescribed, and government leaders are bringing home the pork for their own districts. The Sangha who's saying don't steal, and we share our resources equally, and we don't take life, that acts as like a conscience to the rest of society in some way. So the Buddha established the Sangha, and throughout the ages, wherever Buddhism went, the Sangha community went too. Of course, there were many instances where the Sangha had many difficulties. In Japan, the government wanted to break the power of the Sangha, so they, in the middle of the 19th century with the Meiji Restoration, they said that the Sangha should marry. And then, of course, when you stop having groups of people living together in monasteries and instead they have their family homes, then those people can't act as a political force that challenge the government, and governments are always afraid of political forces, and this is essentially what the communists did when they took over Tibet and Laos and Cambodia and Mongolia and places like that, and Vietnam, is they closed down the monasteries and sent people home because they fear the power of a group of people, even if that group of people is intent on virtue. So, there were changes in how the Sangha lived in different countries and in different ways, and many challenges that people had to face, and many adaptations that had to be made, because the original way that the Buddha set out the life of the Sangha was not always suitable in the different climates or the different social environments and so on where Buddhism spread. So, different groups change things for different purposes. So, for example, in China, the Zen practitioners, they left the city because they didn't want to be involved with all the politics and government things that went on in the city. So they went out to the countryside to live. So you can't go on Pindapat with your alms bowl in the countryside, because there aren't many people there. So they started to grow their own food, even though we're not supposed to plow the earth and dig the earth. Okay, but in those conditions, you can see that they had a reason for doing it. That was, good for their practice. In Thailand, well, actually, when you take the precepts, you're supposed to take them for the duration of your life. But in Thailand and Burma, there's the feeling that even if somebody is ordained, they encourage all the men to get ordained for 6 weeks or for 3 months, and say it's good for the family and so on. So they allow people to take the full ordination without really having the full intention to keep the precepts for their whole life, but only to keep them for a while and then return them. So that kind of change was made. When Buddhism went to Tibet, a quarter of the male population was ordained, and then some nuns as well. And for them to all go in the village in the morning with their alms bowl, the villages couldn't support that many people. And so they began receiving gifts of land, which then they had farmers till, and they often had the income from that. That happened in China as well. This eventually backfired and was one of the reasons why the communists took over and confiscated all the land. And in Tibet also, people had their own private benefactors and family support and other people's support, because the monasteries were so large that they couldn't support all the individuals there. So different changes were made. Some, had very good results, and some, kind of had problematic results. Anyway, then probably they always say that Buddhism started coming to the West in the 17th century, I guess, when Colonel Alcott went to Sri Lanka, and and he learned about Buddhism and so on. And with better transportation, different people from China and Sri Lanka were able to come to the West and so on. And then there was this big Parliament of World Religions in 1898 where Buddhism was, featured maybe for the first time, I don't know. But it's said to be kind of a hallmark in people learning that Buddhism exists. And then you had different European explorers who went into various parts of China and Tibet and missionaries, and many of these people misunderstood what Buddhism was all about, but they wrote books and those ideas became well known even though they were erroneous. But never mind. But especially in the 20th century, I think more Westerners became interested in Buddhism, and probably, my generation was the first generation where it really kind of caught on full force. Before there were, of course, individuals who went to different places in Asia and ordained and practiced and so on, but kind of my generation was the first one, I think, that went full force. And this pertains to all the Buddhist traditions, especially in terms of the Tibetan tradition, because the Tibetans didn't have many visitors in their country. They call themselves the land of snows, so that, encircled by mountains, except a little bit in the west. You can get into China more easily, but you have the Himalayas and the Karakoram Mountains and so on. And they didn't know much about the outside world. So it was really only after 1959 when the communist Chinese government really took over central Tibet that His Holiness Dalai Lama and other Tibetans fled into exile primarily into India. Some went to Nepal, but it was more difficult for them in Nepal. The government wasn't as welcoming. In India, the government of Nehru was incredible and gave the Tibetan refugees land and so on in the south, where they reestablished their monasteries. Of course, they had to clear the land and ask the lions and tigers and bears, ho-ho, to leave. I don't think they had bears, but they did have wild elephants there. And they set up their monasteries, but it was a really hard blow on Tibetan mentality to go into exile. They are a very proud people of their heritage and their culture, and they had, unlike many places in Asia, Tibet has never been occupied by Western countries. Yeah, Tibet hasn't been, Thailand hasn't been. But if you look at, most other Asian countries, at one time or another, there were foreign forces and foreign government there, often British, sometimes French or Dutch or German or something like that. But not Thailand and not Tibet, but when the communists took over Tibet and the Tibetans had to go into exile, it was really crushing for them on the level of their culture and national spirit, but also health-wise, because they went from Tibet, which is very high, where you don't have many viruses and bacteria, into India, which is low, which is full of virus and bacteria. And they were initially housed in the old POW camp that the British held there, where they housed German prisoners. Some of you may have seen 7 Years in Tibet, and Heinrich Herr, that one German, mountain climber, who was caught, and he was imprisoned in Baksu, in this place where later the Tibetans were. And he escaped and went to Tibet, and he was one of the first Westerners who was able to spend, aside Alexandre Devenille, but, to spend extended time there. So, it was a blow to them. Many people died. Coming into exile, many people who remained in Tibet died due to what communism did to all of China, not just to Tibet. The Tibetans sometimes think that they were the only ones that suffered under the communist hand. They blame it on the Chinese. I think it's more communism. Of course there's a cultural, racial thing between the Tibetans and the Chinese. But what happened to all of Buddhism in China after the communist takeover was just horrendous everywhere. It wasn't just Tibet. So when the Tibetans came into exile, their main focus was to reestablish their own monasteries, because they were in exile, floating, not having their own country. And then in Tibet, for those who remained behind, they were getting arrested and thrown in prison or disrobed or whatever. So they really felt that, their tradition's in danger. And their whole attitude was to, really preserve what they had in India as best as they could. So when, and the monastic elements are often the most conservative in societies. If you study Latin American history, the church was the most conservative. Even today we can see, in terms of cultural values, economic forces, the church is often so conservative. Yeah? And so in some ways it's like that in Tibet too. They have their heritage and in the monasteries, and it's very interesting in Tibetan culture. Reform means you go back and do things more as they were originally done earlier on. Here, reform means you invent new ways of doing things. A very different meaning of reform. Okay, but so they were trying to keep Tibetan Buddhism alive in exile, being a conservative element, conserving their history and their culture and their religion and so on. And then who are the Westerners that come to greet them? Are these people who are, half stoned and matted hair. Must have reminded them of the matted hair ascetics, except we weren't ascetic, that came to see the Buddha, kind of half stoned or all stoned, kind of hippie wanderers, exploring whatever there was in the East that was fascinating and esoteric, and stumbled into the Tibetan lamas, and they taught us. It was really kind of amazing. I don't think they had any idea of Western culture, what was going on in our countries that, caused this generation of people to go east. But, they wound up teaching us. And then Buddhism, everybody couldn't stay in the East forever, although many of us planned to and wanted to. The government, the visa problem was always there. And so people wound up going back to their own countries, and they wanted to have Buddhist centers there, not necessarily monasteries. The West is not quite so renounced to have monasteries. Our culture is really one of attachment all over the place. So having Buddhist centers, and so the lamas began to establish either individual centers or networks of centers, and then they would send some of their older students, who were very often monastics, to live and work in those centers. And so Buddhism in the Tibetan tradition began, to spread west. It happened that way in the Thai tradition too, but in a little bit different way, in that and also in China, because Chinese Buddhism continued on. Not all the Chinese were in exile. The Thais never became communist. neither did the Burmese. So they always maintained their national integrity. And, you know, why many Vietnamese, you know, went to France or to the US, you know, somehow things were able to stay on there too. And they had a very different reaction to the Westerners coming there. In Thailand, they really welcomed the Westerners because they were in the process of modernizing the country. And here are people from the modern West who think Buddhism is great. And so they really welcomed the Westerners. The men, of course, the women were welcomed as benefactors, but we weren't able to, they don't ordain women as nuns. They have what's called Maichi, which is, you're still a lay person, you put on white and you take 8 precepts, but you're not technically a nun. You don't have the privileges that the Sangha has with the Thai government. But the Westerners who are ordained in the Thai tradition were very respected in Thailand. And then when they came to establish monasteries in the West, they were well supported by Thai immigrants in Western countries. In China or Taiwan, you had a similar thing, the Westerners who met the Dharma. So most of those Westerners met the Dharma in the US. Master Hua was a major person from City of 10,000 Buddhas. And then, of course, some people met other masters in Taiwan. But the Chinese, too, welcomed the Westerners and supported them. The Western Sangha supported them financially, and they lived in the Chinese temples or whatever. They were supported and well taken care of. For those of us, and also it seems in the Vietnamese tradition, at least with Thich Nhat Hanh's group, the Sangha there is very well supported. You know, they've mostly set up outside Vietnam because even now the communist government is giving them a lot of difficulties, but they're well supported by the Vietnamese immigrant community in France and in the West, and now more and more by Westerners as well, as Westerners ordain in that tradition. In the Tibetan Buddhism, it was different though, because the Tibetans saw the Westerners as people who could who could raise money to send back to India or to Tibet to support the monasteries. So while they ordained us, they didn't have the mind to support us. We were basically ordained and left to float. We could, you know, our teachers' organizations had places to live, but they were lay centers, and if we lived there, then we had to do certain jobs and certain work to earn our room and board. Otherwise, we couldn't stay there. Or if we wanted to just stay in India, then we had to pay in the different monasteries or different places where we lived, which means that you had to have some income of your own. And if you had a family that gave you money, that was good, but for the rest of us, you know, financially it became difficult. Even when we started setting up monasteries in the West, the Sangha had to pay to stay there. And so keeping your precepts and getting the money to pay to stay at a monastery doesn't go very well together, okay? I lived in a monastery in France, 1982 to 1985. We were just starting the monastery that was in Lavore, France. And there was a Dharma center, and the nuns' quarters was in the horse stables. And you know, it's not like the center itself was rich, but you know, to be able to stay in the horse stables, then we had to work so many hours in the Dharma center itself, And so we worked in the kitchen, and we worked cleaning the lay people's toilets and doing things like that. So not the usual role that monastics had in relationship with the laity. Some of the nuns, there was one nun there, her family gave her money, so it was much easier for her. There was another nun from Sweden who went back to Sweden every summer to work at a job and get enough money so she could live at the monastery during the year. There were some people who had benefactors, some people who stayed at the monastery for a short time and then they had to go back and get some work. And then people like me, who I sewed robes, and then people would give me a little money for that, or you know, at the end some people gave me some money to live, but we all had to pay to stay there. So it was very, very difficult. And even in the U.S., in the Tibetan tradition, when you look around, there are many Dharma centers, and there are places that are called monasteries. But if you look, they either aren't monasteries or they're monasteries for Tibetans. Gampo Abbey is an exception. It's in Canada. But they are also part of a larger group, Shambhala International, which is a lay organization. So they have to do their monastic thing within the governance of a lay organization. You know, you have places in New York, in Wisconsin, and so on, where there's groups of some Tibetan monks who live. But not so many Western monastics there, and you know, they don't necessarily live together as a community. And then of course many Dharma centers where you can stay if you perform a job and you know, and do things there, but you don't really get a monastic education because the Dharma centers are focused on educating the lay community. So, Laurie, you live at a Dharma center, don't you?
Yes, I do.
Yeah, so Laurie can kind of tell us what that's like. We can talk about it at lunch, and you can share some of your experience, you know, and your observation. But so it's been quite difficult for the Western monastics. You know, in terms of myself, you know, I went to India. The first time was in 73. I didn't know about Buddhism at that time. And then I met the Dharma in 75 and went back to Nepal. In 75 I went to Nepal. And, you know, so we had to support ourselves, and then we also had visa problems, and then many people had health problems as well. It's easier now in India, although many people still do get sick, but the conditions are much, much better than when I went there. So there were always